Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of Scale by Design. Today, we are joined by Kevin Philpott. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, James, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it, buddy.
Yeah, man, we're really thrilled to have you here. And, I'm very excited to speak with you today. Before we jump into all the cool topics we want to discuss, would you mind just sharing with everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. In my past, I've been a design leader for brands like Geico, designed for, IBM, Quicken Loans, Office Depot, Credit Karma. I'm currently the head of UX for Pi Insurance, which is kind of one of the fastest growing insurtechs in the United States. And with all that, I'm blessed to have, thankfully, always had very strong teams helping me deliver that UX along the way. My passion is really evangelizing UX, right? I love user experience. And over the last 6 months or so, I've really tried to kind of start sharing that as well too. So I've been doing talks for UXPA, all three of the top HCI schools, stands for Human Computer Interaction. So Carnegie Mellon, University of Washington, Georgia Tech, plus some conferences like FinTech Design Summit, UX Istanbul, things like that. And currently I've been publishing a lot in Forbes, and I've been lucky enough to have some of my research go pretty broad. So I've been cited in over 50 countries at this point. And all of that is really just what you would see on a resume. But I actually like to be a human being as well too, as opposed to just rattling off bullet points of things that are fantastic. And I love just hanging out with folks that are interested in design and trying to make the world a little bit better by providing some of those better experiences in the way that I can.
I love it. And now you've been at Pi Insurance for about actually a little bit over 5 years. Can you tell us a little bit about how much the organization has scaled and maybe where it was when you started in terms of headcount and in terms of sophistication when it comes to UX and product design and overall just product development and a little bit about that scale journey and where it is today, just so we have some context to your perspective as of late.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just kind of give you some context setting here about Pi Insurance, right? Pi Insurance offers insurance protection for small business owners. So if someone gets hurt on the job while they're working, if they slip, if they trip, if you're traveling from spot A to B for a work-related purpose, that's kind of what the product does, right? And we're starting in workers' comp, but our primary goal is to provide commercial insurance protection for small business owners. So the other thing I should probably say is that there are some things that are kind of uniquely different about Pi Insurance, right? We can save folks that are getting workers' comp insurance up to 30%. So anyone that works in the insurance space knows that price is, the thing that a lot of people are concerned about because you want it to be affordable. The other thing is that we offer our product through a broad range of channels, whether it's an insurance broker that wants to come to us or direct consumer, you get a quote in as little as 5 minutes. And we also have an API so that you don't have to just come through our partner portal or through our website. If you want to do it in the comfort of your own systems, we allow that experience as well too. We have a super broad underwriting appetite. That's important because insurance agents, they don't want to go to a bunch of different places, right? They want to just go to one particular carrier if they can get away with that and do that for convenience. And we kind of offer that benefit as well too. And the key thing here is that we're offering instant decisions on about 73% of what are called class codes, which are like the risk type in workers' comp. But what that means is you get that number, or you understand if you can kind of proceed or not instantly, which is obviously what everybody wants in this day and age, right? And that's kind of just a little bit of context, but why don't I stop with like, hey, what is Pi, and break a little bit into me and how did I get into this? How did I fall into it? So, James, I was the first employee at Pi Insurance, and imagine this setting. I have a stable job. My wife is pregnant, and I'm like, hey, you know what? I should do. I should leave my job and I should join a startup in insurance, which are not two things you hear together very often. And by the way, they don't have any customers yet, right? That's a tad awkward, right?
Sounds a little bit stressful today.
A little bit of a tough conversation.
Right. How did that go? Obviously it worked out, but
retrospectively, it went very, very well. But I can't really imagine, you're an entrepreneur, right? And you take risks, and that those risks can sometimes alter the course of your life, right? And so I can't imagine what my life might be like if Pi Insurance hadn't grown incredibly dramatically, right? So that's the kind of personal risk that you're talking about there, right? So, you start off, there's one employee,
what did the product look like back in the day when you first started? What was that like? Tell us a little bit about where it was and the iterations from that point forward.
It's a great question, and I'm sure you're familiar with all this kind of with the philosophy of agile thinking and iterative design. So like way back, the product was essentially a website, right? Like, are people interested in this, right? And then we had a rater tool which allowed people to kind of engage with us and see how much they were kind of overpaying for workers' compensation insurance. And that allowed us also to kind of like, understand, how much people would want to kind of go further with that when they understood it, right? So that was like very, very early days. It was just like, hey, informational, this is what you could be saving. And then very quickly, we kind of moved into, here is the ability to get a quote. And we were one of the first to allow people to buy workers' compensation insurance online, right? So that was like very early days, what the kind of product was. And really what that's all about, you say product, right? But this is like, imagine you're a small business owner. For some of these small business owners, workers' compensation is a pretty significant line item, right? And so, we're helping those kind of Main Street kind of small businesses really protect their employees. And they can, like a lot of these small businesses, like they know and love their employees. So we're trying to get them to get the coverage that they need, but also they were overpaying. They really were, right? So we were helping them do that. So that was what the original product looked like, right?
Gotcha. And so fast forward now, how big is the product and UX team? I mean, what does the org look like today?
Yeah, no, that's it's a great question, right? So 5 years ago, we're looking at like zero of everything, right? And now,
right,
in the first 4 months of 2022, right, we've increased our annual run rate premium to nearly 300 million, right? Mm-hmm. We're serving 2,800 independent agents. That's 30,000 applications coming in each month. And on top of all of that, like sales growth, right? We've got policyholders at a retention rate of greater than 80%, right? So zero to that has been really quite a phenomenal growth trajectory for any small business. And what does that mean for UX and my team, right? Now we're give or take contractors and such, we're at 5 folks, right? So that's still relatively small given the amount of growth, but I think that's very doable, right? If you do it the right way, you can absolutely have that level of efficiency.
Sure. And so when you're talking about like scaling out your team, I would love to hear a little bit about how you go about hiring specifically for UX. Like what are the skill sets in the background that you're looking for as you hire for your own team?
Yeah, and it changes over time, which is kind of the interesting thing. So, in UX, you've got a couple of core skill sets. You've got information architecture, right? That's kind of, how do you organize the information on your website? You've got user research. Do you even know what your customers want, right? You've got visual design, and you've got interaction design, right? And interaction design is, essentially it's like all of the little things that happen on the way to getting your experience, right? If it's like a lot of it is form design. So it's like, are you using an easy to understand set of steps to get people to purchase a product. It can be like all of the little interactions on a field, right? It's all of those little things as you interact with the website, right? And if I cast my mind back to day one, right? Interaction design is really, really important for a lot of products. Visual design might be incredibly important for, say, an entertainment type website or something that's a very visually oriented product. But interaction design is really critical when you've got any kind of product where someone has to do something, right? So the first hire, I was the first hire, but my first hire was someone who was strong in interaction design. And in a startup, and I'm sure you've come across this yourself, right? Like your first couple of hires, they're really important. And also, they kind of have to be able to hit the ground running, right? So the first hire was Jeremy Pike, who's one of the best designers I've ever worked with and is, of course, still with us, right? Much further beyond senior now, right? But that was super critical to get in place, that particular skill set. And after that, you can start building up the team around it, right? But one thing that I learned pretty early on is like, you want to start thinking about ratios as soon as possible. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, how many UX professionals do you need relative to your engineering team? And you'll read a lot about that online and they'll give numbers, but the most important one is normally the front-end engineers to the UX, because back-end might be able to work away on their own, right? They might just be building APIs, right? But you really want to learn over time what that right number is for your organization, right? So that's an important ratio. You typically want to have about 5 UX professionals to 1 UX leader, right? UX is complicated. You do not want to have a span of 8 or 9 UX professionals. It's too much, right? And then the last one I'll give you is just 1 UX researcher to a team of about 5 UX professionals is about good too. And when you focus on those ratios, that allows you to scale, right? You don't have to necessarily go back and change that over time. So that's in a nutshell how we kind of grew UX at Pi.
Sure. So what was the exact ratio from front-end engineers to UX though? Like what is that supposed to look like?
Yeah, I actually won't even give you an exact number because it really depends on the organization and it really depends on the efficiency of your organization. But what I would say is you monitor that for a year or two, and whatever that number looks like, right, then you start building off that.
So efficiency, like what else would you like? How do you go about? Do you have any more insight on like how you go about making that determination? Like you're looking at like what specific things do you kind of evaluate in order to determine what that ratio should look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is I think where science and art meet, right? When you're in a startup and you're growing in the early days, you might find that you have, you might be hiring ahead of yourself, or you might be hiring a little bit behind, right? So to look at the exact number of UX folks to engineers, you need to do that little bit of adjustment as well too. You might be like, hey, look, we've got, 2 UX folks now, and we've got 10 front-end engineers, and we've got a bunch of other back-end engineers, but we know that's too strained, right? We know that's not working. So that's kind of what I mean here a little bit about efficiency, is you got to factor some of that in as well too. And sometimes you're learning, right? Like in the early days, in the super early days, you're probably never going to get more efficient, right? It's like a small group of people and they're going to produce a product, and that's super efficient. And then you grow for maybe 2 or 3 years, and you're hiring people, and now you're trying to figure it out. You're shifting from there's a couple of small people in a room able to knock stuff out to, hey, actually, we need processes, we need communication, we need to figure out how that works. So at that point, you might also say, hey, actually, we think our long-term ratio here could actually be much better. We just need to figure some of this stuff out, right?
Gotcha. And so after the first hire, can you tell us a little bit about so you did interaction design first, somebody who was really strong in that. what walk us through the course, like the hires that came after that. What kind of skill sets did you prioritize for your second, third hire?
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. So, once you have interaction design in there, you're really looking for what I would describe as a UX generalist, right? Which kind of has little pieces of those. Now, you typically can't get someone who's like a rock star in information architecture, research, visual design, and interaction design, right? So, it can be based on your type of business. Just starting off as a company, information architecture was not super critical, right? Like, we're not a library or a company that has like tons and tons of content, so that wasn't like super critical out of the gate, right? User research was, right, but we didn't need a full-time user researcher out of that, right? So basically, with user research, you want someone who can do UX design plus, spend maybe 10-20% of their time doing user research as well too. And with user research, you're really looking for someone, there's a lot of user research techniques, but the ones that get used most frequently are usability testing, user interviews, right? I mean, those are the two primary methods, right? So, I would say the first 3 or 4 hires we had were all kind of in that kind of vein. And then the only thing there I would say is, like, you do need a certain amount of visual design, right? Like, you need to not appear like a sketchy company, right? You do not want to have no visual design. That's terrible, right? But most UX designers can do visual design. You can also hire someone to provide your style guide or your design kit, if you will, and some of your branding, so that then you don't necessarily have to have your UX designers doing all of that. You can kind of buy some of that in, and then they can very easily reuse it, right? So we did a lot of work at the start kind of around our branding, right? To make sure that was on point. But then the 2 key areas until we reached 5 employees were really around interaction design and user research. And then on the 5th, we hired a full-time researcher.
Okay, cool. And so I suppose, like, if you're moving in, it's like a 1-person UX department, or when you're at the early stages of building out a UX team, I'm assuming, like, maybe this, so the reason you don't hire the user research first is because maybe that the head of UX to some extent is probably doing some of that to uncover the priorities for the UX department, right? And
yeah,
I mean, that's what you, as you said, you don't need a full-time person doing that, but that's probably the role of the UX leader at first, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be honest, like, when you're in that early stage role, right, everyone's a kind of player coach. And right, even when there's 2 people, I'd done some research, we'd bought some research, like, you can outsource the research as well too and just manage it, right? And then you can, like, our first senior UX designer was also doing research, right? So you that's kind of how you kind of make that up as you go along. You just make sure that someone is doing a little bit here and there. The challenge you find when you scale, though, is if you have, like, a very typical trap that I see a lot of companies fall into, is they just hire UX designers, right? And they don't hire any full-time user researchers. And a challenge with that is, if your company is a startup, it's very tactically driven at times, right? In terms of, like, we got to get to the next thing. And what can happen in that scenario is the UX designers end up being focused on just build the next thing, just build the next thing. And you actually need to have someone who's 100% dedicated at some point, in my opinion, to user research, to make sure that you get enough of that.
Right. Well, right. I think that's, so one of the challenges being just getting, maybe sometimes UX teams maybe falling into to just focusing on tactics versus really over thinking about, like, more so strategic level thinking and cross-functional thinking. And I think that is, I would love to learn, maybe we can dive a little bit further into that and kind of go into how design process kind of changes as you grow and as you start thinking about how you're interacting with your peers and engineering and product, and just how the org becomes a little bit more sophisticated over time. Could you walk us through what that looks like from early stages, 1-person UX, to then being building a UX team that with a company that now has around 350 employees? And what does that look like?
Yeah, and let's start with the process, right? So, year 1 and 2, right? You might have virtually no process, right? You have or maybe it's not fair to say no process. It's probably more of an intuitive process, right? It's not codified. You don't have to teach people it per se, right? So it might be you, if you're a UX professional, and a couple of engineers sitting around the table, and that's your process, right? You know what your deadline date is, you know what you got to produce, and it can be almost as simple as that. It's super efficient in the early days, right? And then, at that scale, shared understanding almost just exists by default, right? But then you grow a little bit more, and let's say year 2 and 3, you kind of now need to tighten up a little bit, right? You probably need to make sure that you're going through the process each time of empathizing with your user, defining the problem. Super important, because everything else after that, if you get it wrong, doesn't really work. Ideating, let's make sure we're looking at a couple of things, not just like early days where it might be, hey, we got to hit this deadline, we think this is best, let's get it out. Prototyping and testing, right? So you're really getting into that kind of like more formal, at least mindset, right? You might be doing research on most things, right? You're still probably a little bit selective because you probably don't have enough time to do it on everything, right? You may or may not create a prototype. You might just be like, hey, we got a quick sense of this, we need to get it out, let's keep going. And your ability to iterate might be limited by time as well too. In year 2 and 3, you're still kind of under a lot of like execution pressure potentially, right? And you've got the beginnings of a design system coming, right? You've kind of done a couple of experiences. If you put them together, they kind of make sense. You have that look and feel going, but you don't really have a proper design system yet. And then year 3 to 5, I think, is where it really takes off, right? You've got you should really, as early as possible as you can, build that design system with engineering, right? That's massive from an efficiency perspective, right? You want to be able to reuse as much as you can. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time you're trying to do something, particularly if you've got multiple experiences you're trying to design, right? You're documenting maybe some of your processes, you're communicating your processes to other people in the organization. You're getting big now, right? People need to understand how this works. You're probably doing, you're using tools like Jira, maybe Dovetail for your user research. You might have to have an intake process to prioritize your research needs. And you're also measuring you're really making sure you're measuring your value at this point. You might get away with that in year 1. You really need to make sure you've got like good metrics around your UX outputs at this point, so you can know what the outcomes are. And then finally, I think year 5 plus, you're getting into pretty sophisticated design systems. You might have almost a body that makes sure your designs are up to scratch, right? You might have a voice of the customer system, right? You're systematically looking at the performance of all of your experiences, and that's driving some of your roadmap, right? You have a roadmap, right? A UX roadmap, essentially. And you've got budgets, you're bringing people in. Training becomes a much more important thing because you're trying to build a team, right? You're probably even educating folks about best practices, lean UX. So that's and then you can continue on that cycle for forever. But that's a quick sense of like that evolution from early stage to kind of 5 years.
Gotcha. And can you talk to us a little bit more about just like general like UX vision and strategy, right? How do you really work alongside your peers to really continue to develop that strategy as well?
Yeah. So you might have heard the term product design in the same sentence, even sometimes, as UX design. And it's a little bit of a trend in the industry, and it is badly defined. Like, what is the product designer versus UX designer? But if you go and you look, and I have at a lot of different definitions out there, one of the common trends that you'll kind of see with that is one of the main differences is product designers don't just design for users, they also design for the business as well too. I would tell you that I think most UX designers, if they're not designing for the business, may not find themselves growing their career as much as possible, right? So regardless of what your title is, you need to be thinking about what the business is, right? And that's where I think vision for UX begins. You need to understand what the business vision is first, right? You are aligning with that. You're making sure you understand your business's, mission, vision, what's their strategy. Ideally, you want everyone on your team, if you're using OKRs or KPIs or other kind of metrics, I'm a firm believer that your UX folks should have a good understanding of those, not just the people in the business, right? So you understand that first, and then from there, you think about, well, what is the vision for the experience that we would need to have in order to realize that for the organization, right? And there's a lot of, putting that out there, discussions internally to kind of align that, right? You're communicating the vision. I think you need to, as a UX leader, you have to, it's part of your job is to make it exciting for folks. Sometimes it's not that exciting as a business to say, hey, our sales growth is to grow from X to Y, right? It can be much more exciting for the business and can get much more buy-in from folks by painting that picture of what this amazing experience is that you're going to deliver in order to do that. That can change. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But I think that's a key role that UX can play in the organization in terms of actually building that vision, right? And of course, once you've got that kind of vision in place and you've kind of thought about your strategy of how are we going to get there, you do need to make sure that every design you're producing is tied to something measurable, right? Ideally, it ladders up to your OKRs or your KPIs, right? You might be instead dealing with some leading indicators before that, right? It could be, conversion rate in some form that you're designing. But the important thing is that each and every designer knows what basically the success of their design, right? I released this. What impact did this have? Because the reason that's important is because then you have continuous learning, right? And you can adapt and you can identify problems early on, right? And so that's really important for UX designers because I feel a lot of times they're focused on qualitative research, but I really think to be successful in an organization, you do your folks a disservice by not teaching them the language of the business and also getting them involved in, hey, how do I measure the impact to the organization of my design, right? So that kind of, brings you from the vision all the way down to how do you kind of understand if you're making progress towards your strategy or not, right? And I think the other thing is you really have to make sure that everyone in your team understands, right? So what do? You're setting expectations, right? So they understand that and you have a dialogue with them because maybe you're wrong initially, right? You are helping them with timelines, right? What does the roadmap look like? When do we need to achieve this stuff by? You kind of basically just repeat that. You repeat over and over again that kind of maybe quarterly process of setting that strategy, seeing how you're doing and going along that way. So that in a nutshell is how I would see it.
Okay, cool. And could you, I would love to talk a little bit more about metrics. So specifically, what type of metrics are you tracking? I know you mentioned one of the things was actually understanding the outcome of pushing out a release, making a change. So maybe we could talk about both of those things, general metrics, and then how more specifically you measure the success of a design.
Yeah. So again, you're starting from whatever your company's OKRs or KPIs are, right? But I'll just use some examples here, right? I'll use some common ones. Sales, right? So that might be you want to increase sales of your product from 10,000 to 20,000, right? As a UX designer, you don't have control over all of that process, right? So you probably are designing some sort of online onboarding or application form or shopping cart, right? And things you can look at as an early indicator of your likelihood to sell more can be conversion rate. So that's the kind of the number of people that start your shopping process to those that either make a purchase online or end up going off and talking to somebody else, right? And then finishing the purchase. There's also time on task, right? That's a pretty decent indicator of, are you making it easier? Now, it's not perfect, right? Sometimes a little bit of extra time can actually make things a lot better for the user. But as a general rule of thumb, if something's taking you like an hour or a couple of days to do for more sophisticated products, reducing that is normally perceived as a good thing, right? So conversion rate and time on task are two great ones. And then the other one, especially in your user experience, some sort of satisfaction metric, right? So this could be survey that you pop in your study, or it can be NPS. But one of the challenges I think with NPS for small companies is it can take a long time for it to get to statistical significance, or to ladder up that one experience you did to your NPS and not be like enough of the overall experience to be felt, right? So you can kind of like bootstrap it a little bit at the start, and it can be just like, hey, what was the satisfaction before I did something versus after I did something, right? And then what you're doing is you're taking all of that stuff and you're looking at your overall sales process as it ladders up to a KPI. And then you get into all sorts of fun stuff if you kind of have an online process that then connects into an offline process, right? Because you could maximize your digital conversion. I'll use a fake example here, but I'll just make this up, right? I am shopping for a mortgage, right? I remove questions from my online mortgage application process, which improves my conversion. I cut out some of the steps that are explanatory, also reduces my time on task. And you know what? It improves my conversion as well too, right? Then someone gets to the sales process, talking to someone over the phone. Next thing, they don't have the information they needed, right? So now I might be negatively impacting my conversion rate later on. You know what? Maybe we didn't collect the information we needed to properly price the product early on. So that could negatively impact conversion later on, right? So you really have to, while you are in UX, you have to be aware of that, because you're really looking at the CX, the customer experience. You're looking at the end-to-end experience, and you're looking at the end-to-end metrics like sales. You can't just entirely focus on your world, right? So that's a little bit of an idea of like, how do you get from KPIs to something that you can measure in UX, and how does it all fit together?
So that's a really good example. And that's usually when I think about UX interacting with the organization, I'm thinking about interactions with product and engineering. But what I love about that example is it's talking more about potentially relationship with sales, customer success, marketing as well. I feel like I'm assuming, I mean, even just as somebody who's used B2C applications, I feel like that is an area a lot of companies drop the ball with.
Yeah, I would say, a very common research tool in the UX space is customer journey mapping, right? And one of the beauties of customer journey mapping is it can, like, if you do it the right way, what you're doing is you're starting at the very start of your experience. If you're, online feeding to talking to someone over the phone, you're tracking it all the way along, right? And those types of methodologies, or honestly just talking to some of your folks in sales or service, right, really reveal some of that type of stuff, the disconnects between your different departments. And that could be product and engineering and UX, right, versus your sales team, right? That's a valid disconnect, right? So you really have to, like, I find it super valuable to track that process from start to finish, because you start to find things like, oh, we didn't ask for this thing online, and now our sales folks don't have that piece of information. They have to go look it up. That delays them getting back to the customer, right? It negatively impacts the customer's experience, right? So you kind of got to follow through all those different examples by looking at it holistically, because that is how it works. Like, I don't know about you, but like when you're doing UX right, UX folks are involved in the training with sales and service, right? A product goes live. You have to understand how you're handing off to this other group, or else it ain't going to go well. And sometimes that doesn't happen, but you really have to be looking at it that way.
Sure. And I feel like it's just highly situational as well, right?
Yes.
For some companies, it might mean a closer partnership with sales. Others, it might mean closer partnership with customer success, because it's customers that are already onboarded. That, you know, the way that you optimize the workflow could have different implications on how people interact with customer success, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so I find that really fascinating, and that's a really helpful insight. We're coming up on time, and we have time for one more topic. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about career development for people that want to really elevate their game within UX. How would you recommend going from more of a maybe entry level, mid, or maybe even senior level role into breaking into management leadership? Are there any lessons learned that you could share with people out there that want to take their career to the next level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? In school, and this is not really, I think, super different from UX, but most of your training in UX is around how do I do the best research? How do I create the best prototype? The technical skill set, right? And then, of course, when you want to make that pivot to leadership, you have to, like, the skill set changes. Now it's about your soft skills, right? So the earlier, I think, in your career that you start identifying that and practicing that, because that can take a long time to just get right, the better, right? So in UX, you know, you're talking about persuasion. You know, how do you get really good at taking a design and collecting feedback with different stakeholders and presenting that? And the difference between, you know, I think a successful senior and someone on the track to leadership is that they really have the ability to understand the perspectives of people in other departments in their organization and use that in building a kind of like more collaborative solution and pitching that as a way to improve the organization overall, right? So I think persuasion and pitching and just getting as much experience with that as possible is helpful. I should think public speaking is a good one, right? If you can do some conferences, you know, UXPA does a whole bunch of conferences and tries to get newer folks involved, right? I think the more comfortable you get with speaking, the easier it becomes for you to become a voice within your organization, right? And I guess maybe another thing is just, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like the little things you need to do to move projects forward. That might also be soft skills, right? Little things like, instead of saying, when do you think we can get this done by? If there's real time pressure, slight rephrasing to how soon do you think you can get this by, right? You know, you're showing the urgency. You're trying to ask for like, hey, no, really, how quickly can we get this done, right? It can be, instead of coming into a meeting and saying, hey, we looked at the research, this is what we're going to do. It's about bringing people along. You might have to involve them appropriately so in the research process, right? And instead of saying this is definitively what I, you know, think we should do, it's because you never really know that. You might say, based on X and Y, citing the evidence, I hypothesize that the best next step for us is X. Are there any violent objections to moving forward on that, right? So you're really trying to find little ways to kind of move the whole project forward, because sometimes things can just get stuck. And you want to be the UX leader that gets things done, right? So those are some of the things I think that are like the softer skills from a UX perspective that help to grow great leaders.
Right. It's like it's how well do you understand overall business strategy, how the different functions work together, how to move people along and get buy-in from people on your own team and also cross-functionally. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, generally just moving into leadership in general, or even if you're, you know, founder CEO, right? your ability to kind of to rally the troops and get everybody bought into the vision of what you want to create is generally speaking one of the most important skill sets, right?
That's exactly right.
And it kind of ties back to what you were saying about creating a compelling future, talking about experience. What kind of experiences and outcomes do we want to create at a business level, a business outcome level? So I 100% agree with you, and that's super very helpful insight. And I would love to continue chatting. We're coming up on time here, so I just want to say thank you for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Hey, look, this has been a blast. Really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course, Kevin. And to everybody else tuning in, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.